Deep breath.
Okay, thank you. Sorry I was a little bit late. Hello everybody, my name is Christopher Lewis. For those who don't know me, I am a lead solutions engineer working for VMware on behalf of the Cloud Management Business Unit, and I essentially work day in, day out talking about vRealize automation and how wonderful it is. But one of the key things right now is over the last 12-18 months, we introduced vRealize Automation 8, and vRealize Automation 7, where most people are right now, goes end of life in April 2022, I think it is. And so we're actively encouraging people to migrate to vRealize Automation 8, but it's not as easy as you probably would hope it would be. So hopefully today's session, I'm going to talk through an overview of what's in vRealize Automation 8 and why you should migrate, and then talk about the differences between vRealize Automation 7 and vRealize Automation 8, and hopefully how we can get there. The slide deck is pretty long, and so I'm going to pick and choose some of the slides as we go through. I normally do this in an hour and a half, so 45 minutes is going to be no problems at all. So first of all, I put this slide deck on every presentation I give for VMware, mainly because as an ambassador for vRealize Automation within the company, I tend to hear lots of things that are up and coming, and I sometimes forget that they're not in the product. I don't think any of that will happen today, but if it does, there's the disclaimer to say whatever I talk about may or may not happen. So that's a catch-all disclaimer. And again, for those who don't know me, so vRealize Suite is my main area of specialism, as well as the VMware Cloud Services from a vRealize perspective, vSphere, NSX, and VMware Cloud and AWS, to a lesser extent. So at a very high level, what is the reason for vRealize Automation, or the vRealize Cloud Suite, in fact, not just automation? And that's really about making the clouds invisible to your end customers, and making sure that actually whether when a user requests a virtual machine or a cloud service, or it could be a whole application, they shouldn't really care where it sits. They shouldn't really care what platform it sits on, whether that be AWS, Azure, or Google, or vSphere. They just should worry about getting on with their day job, delivering value to the business, and as long as the virtual machine or the service they're requesting gives them the capabilities they're expecting, that's really what they should be worrying about. And it's really the vRealize Suite that helps deliver that invisibility, if you like, transparent but invisible, if that's such a thing. So vRealize Automation 8, and apologies if anybody's seen me do this presentation before. It's not a new presentation, it's something I've delivered over the last sort of 6 months or so, but I think it's relevant. So migrating from 7 to 8, so 8 gives you a much better, a much more modern architecture. It's based on, and I promised myself I wouldn't say this word in my presentation, but it's based on Kubernetes. Kubernetes microservices, and all the services of vRealize Automation 8 are now within that. Moved away from sort of the monolithic application style of sort of SQL Server, .NET Framework, Windows-based product, and moved into much more of a microservices architecture. And that means it's a quicker time to value. So it's a lot less to deploy. Not saying there's less resources, but there's a lot less virtual machines required to deploy this. It's infrastructure as code at its heart, DevOps mentality at its heart, very much an API first platform, and unlike its predecessor, where it was a little bit of a bolt-on, if we're completely honest. So anything that you do in the user interface, you can also do via the API service if you want to. You can control it via Terraform, you can consume Terraform with it, and all sorts of things like that. So very much a developer-friendly deployment, and a sort of cloud management platform. Multi-cloud, so it supports both vSphere-based clouds, it's a VMware product, so that's why it supports vSphere as well. But AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud as well. And it's extensible. It's not just all about what we do out of the box. Like with its predecessor, we can extend that using vRealize Orchestrator, now SaltStack as well, and action-based extensibility or functions as a service. And we wrap all that up in a policy governance framework that enables you to restrict what people can do to what, so that they don't make mistakes and destroy things they shouldn't destroy. And please feel free to ask questions at any point. Otherwise, I will just carry on talking for 45 minutes. So there are now 5 key services within vRealize Automation. There is the service broker, which is the service catalog, and that's where we create all our governance policies. And that's where if you are lucky enough to have approvals, that's where you would go and approve or reject requests on behalf of people. Cloud Assembly is essentially where we do all the main work. It's the workhorse, if you like. That's where we connect to multiple clouds, where we create up sort of cloud templates or blueprints. That's where we configure our extensibility, where we create our projects to give users access to the ability to create resources. And if you're doing private cloud with in conjunction with vRealize operations, then that's where you also configure price cards, so you can show how much things or declare how much things are going to cost. CoStream is our continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines, infrastructure pipelines toolset that used to be a separate product. We brought that into the fold as part of vRealize Automation, and really sort of adds value from a DevOps perspective. vRealize Orchestrator, known and loved by many and hated by few. It's a process automation platform. Anything as a service, it used to be called. Any business process that you can script, you can have a CLI, you can have an API that you can run through vRealize Orchestrator, and you can surface all that up into the service catalog, so that you can then give people the ability to consume that, as well as using that from an extensibility perspective to be able to call out to third-party systems as part of the life cycle of deployment. And then finally, I think around about October last year, we sort of acquired SaltStack, and that's working its way into the product as the releases go. So in 8.3, we can sort of use Lifecycle Manager to deploy a SaltStack, and it's integrated. It's going to be further integrated in 8.4 and then again in 8.5. And I'm hoping around 8.5, 8.6 is where we will sort of see it completely integrated. And that really allows us to do configuration management and event-driven automation, and that using things like SaltStack, salt states and pillars and grains allows us to do extra day 2 actions to that, desired state configuration almost. This is declare what I want these machines to be, and then go off and do them. Any questions? Fabulous. Okay, so from a sort of feature comparison perspective, we don't talk about feature parity, we talk about use case parity, because the platforms are considerably different in the way they approach the different use cases. So you might have use case parity, but functionally it might be done in a different way. And so from a sort of a 7.x perspective, 8.0, 8.1, and post 8.1, and we're now in 8.3, we consider use case parity. There are still some features that may not match, and we're still working on that, but we can, from a use case perspective, we're pretty much where we were from a 7.x perspective. There's still things that so in 8.3 they introduced property groups, which was one of the last things that people were asking for in terms of being able to migrate from 7 to 8. But there's still some other things that need to happen. But from a use case perspective, we're pretty much there. Just again, a sort of a quick look at the architecture. Again, modern architecture based on that Kubernetes Photon OS backbone, Kubernetes master nodes, RabbitMQ and PostgreSQL from a sort of database and a messaging perspective, and that sort of sits on where all the services run for that. Separate to that, as part of the deployment, you also need to have Lifecycle Manager, and you need to have Workspace ONE access to be able to do a user authentication and single sign-on. And when we look at, there's a character that should be there, but when we look at the deployment, it's simplified in terms of you have somewhere between 12 and 15 servers for vRealize Automation 7 in a large deployment. In a cluster deployment that can manage and maintain almost double the amount of virtual machines and deployments, you've got 7 machines. And you can actually just have one appliance for automation and identity manager or Workspace ONE access, and then a Lifecycle Manager appliance, and then you can scale out to 3 if you want to, based on service availability and that you have. One thing I'm often asked is, what are the differences in technologies and concepts? And because they don't always translate, because we've not got necessarily feature parity, we have use case parity. So as an example, in 7, we have fabric groups and endpoints, but in 8 we have cloud zones and cloud accounts. So there's different terminology, but they mean most of the things mean the same and they're synonymous, but it's just a different different words essentially. Project rather than business group. And once you've got your head around that, and for the first 6 months, every time someone said project, in my head I heard business group, and so once you get used to those terminologies, then it's relatively straightforward to translate. When we're looking at virtual machine provisioning, we in vRealize Automation 8 we only really support the cloning, link clones or full clones without some sort of customizations. And when we look at that compared to vRealize Automation 7, this is the clone workflow for vRealize Automation 7. So you get the request in, there's some tasks you can do if you want to call out on the event broker to be able to do third-party sort of integrations at the waiting to build or the building machine stage, and then that's almost before I start doing the cloning. And then when I'm cloning my work template, VM template, there's some stages in that clone process where again I can call out to third-party systems. And once those machines have been cloned, and there could be multiple machines, it goes through this sort of machine provisioned, I've activated it, I've finalized the machine, deactivate it, and finalize the machine. And then when I want to destroy the machine, I then go to the deactivate, the unprovisioned and disposing machine. And so there's quite a lot of states that you can call out to third-party systems, IPAM systems, CMDB, change records. When I click a request, rather than going to my process might be when I click request in the VRA portal, I raise a standard change in my change system, so I'm covered for the deployment. And then once the deployment's finished, I close the change. The other way to do that is to raise a change, and then that as part of in a different service portal if you can do that. So there's multiple things of why you want to call out at different places. In vRealize Automation 8, just from a provisioning perspective, without sort of at least running out and disposing, there are multiple lifecycle states. And what we've done is we've broken down not only the request, but also the different types of resources that you can deploy. So in the previous slide, if you wanted to do something around networks or security or load balancers, that would all have to happen within this virtual machine deployment. You couldn't say, well, if I'm going to create a load balancer, go and do something. It would be, well, before I deploy the machine and I know that load balancer has been created, then go and do something. So it was very difficult to do things around load balancing and networks and security groups. But in 8, what we've done is we've given you a deployment resource sort of set of event topics for you to be able to call out based on load balancers, security groups, and networks. So if I had to create a network, maybe I need to tell the network people that exists, either via email or via, again, might be a CMDB entry. It really depends on what your processes are. but there's a lot more stages in that life cycle of the deployment that can be called out specifically for those different types of resources. And again, you've still got the requested, the reservations, the allocations, the configurations, but then you've got each of those deployment processes. And it's exactly the same with removal. So when you go and click on the button and say, delete my request, it then goes through the same process of, well, I need to destroy this network resource. Is there anything I need to do as part of that? I need to deploy this compute resource. Is there anything I just destroy, sorry. Is there anything I need to do as part of that? And it's going with load balancers and security groups. So there's a lot more flexibility in terms of being able to calling out to third-party systems to be able to, as part of your overall deployment. Because actually, when I talk to customers, the clone of the virtual machine or the deployment of the template is a fraction of the process. It's all the other, oh yeah, that part of the process takes 15 minutes, and then it's 3 days for the networking guys to come and make sure they're okay with it. But you can automate all of that now. And at the right stage, but only do it when you need to do it. Any questions? Okay. So I guess the crux of the conversation is, how do we get to vRealize Automation 8 from 7? And it's not easy. Because of the different architecture types. There isn't an in-place upgrade. That you can't, like with vRealize operations, I can upgrade from, or I used to be able to upgrade from, vRealize operations 6 to 7, and then from 7 to 7.5, and then from 7.5 to, I can actually upgrade from 7, I think, to 8.4 or 8.3 if I wanted to. So because the architecture is very similar, they may have changed the underlying operating system from SUSE Linux to Photon OS, but essentially the architecture and the way they do things is identical. Moving from a predominantly Windows-based architecture to its Kubernetes architecture is a seismic shift in the way we do things, and therefore we can't just do an in-place upgrade. It's a side-by-side deployment with either a transition of content or a migration of content, and we'll explain the differences next. So, from an 8.1 perspective, if you're running 8.1, and you may be running 8.1 depending on the version of, for example, VCF that you're running. And you may not have upgraded from 8.1, it's still supported. You don't have to be at the latest and greatest all the time. We'd love you to be, but there's no reason to do that unless there's a feature or a security fix that we want you to apply. In 8.1, we have a migration assessment. So we will look at your vRealize Automation 7.5 and 7.6 environment and tell you what may migrate easily in a later version, but we won't actually do any of that automated migration for you. It's not automatic, it's automated from an 8.2 perspective. So we'll look at things like endpoints, and whether they can be created into cloud zones, whether they're supported, reservations into cloud zones, and projects into business groups into projects, and how they could be supported. But we don't actually do any of the content migration for you. We don't migrate any of the deployments. But then, we will highlight where things would be supported. Oh, that blueprint can't be migrated because it's got a property group. That's changed in 8.3, but in 8.1, that concept didn't exist. So even if we could migrate, that wouldn't migrate because of a property group. So go away and fix that problem, or wait until a later version when we're supporting it. You have to make the decision really on whether you're going to sunset the 7.6 environment. And some customers I've got have said, we're not doing any more development in 7.6. Everything, we're building a new infrastructure for 8.x. A new underlying infrastructure, and everything new is going to be there, and we're not really worried about migrating content. We'll look at what we're doing and what we're delivering from a service perspective and create it again in 8. And that's one approach. In 8.2 and above, we introduced the migration assistant separate to the migration assessment, in the fact that it does a migration assessment first and then says, well, all this content we've flagged, we can migrate. Would you like us to migrate it for you? And that includes things like those endpoints and moving to cloud zones and approval policies and blueprints or cloud templates that are supported. We don't support things like XADs, migrations if they're using the sort of the Cafe API and stuff like that. So there's certain things we just won't support. And then whatever you're doing, you can always just onboard workloads. But so you migrate the deployment and then onboard the workload to be able to do that. And vRealize Automation 8 is so much better from an onboarding perspective than 7 ever was. Onboarding plans are much more flexible. And actually in 8.3, what we saw is a real improvement in the ability to onboard and then change the owner of a deployment. And that'll some new features coming in 8.4, which will help as well. But one thing to be wary of from an onboarding perspective is we don't onboard right now the IP address management solution that's internal. So if you're using the internal IPAM in vRealize Automation 7 and you've got a VLAN in there and you've got an IP address to a virtual machine, we don't onboard that into vRealize Automation 8. We don't add the record into the internal IPAM. So there's one thing to consider there about how what VLANs you have in 8 compared to what you have in 7. And to make sure you don't get duplicate IP addresses if you're deploying new resources into the same VLANs. If you're using something like an external IP address system like Infoblocks, then that's not a problem. But it's only really a problem with the internal IPAM. And again, we're working on exposing API calls for that internal IPAM to be able to hopefully onboard some networking pieces in the future as well. What are the migration paths? So where do I get from A to B? If I'm running vRealize Automation 8, it's an in-place upgrade to 8.x, and that's relatively self-explanatory. If I'm running 7.5, I can choose to manually transition 7.5 or 7.6. I can manually transition my content. I can deploy a new vRealize Automation, 8.x. It could be a new VCF environment. It could be 8.1, 8.2, 8.3. Really depends on what you want to do. Transition that manual content, and by transition I mean recreate the content, not migrate it, and then onboard all those workloads. And as you onboard the workloads, you can create new deployments, and then you can start working from there. If you're running at 7.5 or 7.6, you can choose to do the migration if you're moving to 8.2 and above. So, I've updated this to 8.3 because that's the latest version, but from 8.2 and above, you can do migrations. Again, based on the number of blueprints and the components that you're using, there may be some things that won't migrate, but majority of the stuff would expect to migrate. If you're using a version of VRA 7.5, then you either have to defer to the transition, or if you want to migrate in the future, then the only place, the place you should be migrating to is 7.6, with a view to migrate to 8 at a later time. We don't support migration for anything under 7.5. So if you're running 7.4, then you're not supported from a migration perspective. You need to get to 7.5 or 7.6, but there's no point in getting to 7.5 if you're below 7.5. The recommendation would be to go to 7.6 and then migrate. Any questions? Okay. So, I mean, overall, there's a transition approach. Apologies, I'm not tracking the questions in the chat. So if there's questions in the chat, I'm not seeing them. But it looks like there's nothing. Oh, there is a question. Sorry. So, is there a plan to have quarterly updates? So, vRealize Automation 8.4 is due out in the future, in the next, in the next month or so. It's in the sort of April-May timeframe, and then we have essentially in vRealize Automation 8 a quarterly release cadence. So vRealize Automation Cloud, exactly the same product, SaaS-based offering, managed by us, maintained by us, consumed by you, has monthly cadence of release. So I think this month's drop's already happened. Next month's drop will be around sort of the middle of the month, and you'll get features and functions dropped to VRA Cloud. Every 3 months, we wrap up all of those new features and then repackage vRealize Automation to be the next version. So 8.4, I said, due out April-May timeframe, and then 3 months later, you'll have 8.5, and 3 months later, you'll have 8.6. So we'll expect to see 8.5 around July sort of time, and then sort of November, December time, we'll have 8.6. Okay, so and when we're looking at transition approach, it's really important to sort of understand where you are, trying to sort of decide, am I having problems with vRealize automation or the deployments, and how, what's the limitations that I'm hitting? Have I had to do lots of extensibilities to work around lots of things in vRealize Automation 7, and getting a sort of like a know where you are point of view, and then you need to assess what vRealize Automation 8 can give you, and actually how I can maybe get rid of some of those extensibility things that I've done around vRealize Automation 7, because some of the features or the functions that I've worked around in 7 now exist in 8. So how how do I change the approach to doing things? And it could be that some of that stuff still hasn't, you may be using it in a completely different way than we expect, and some of that changes may not have occurred, and so there still may be a need for that. Work out who's going to be consuming the platform. Is it going to be via API? Is it going to be via user interface? Is it going to be via Terraform? How do your consumers want to do that? And then work out really what services you've got in 7 that need to migrate to 8. There's no point in migrating everything if that one blueprint or that service gets used once a year, or has never been used since it was deployed, or was used once. Actually, is there a rule that says, if this hasn't been used in 12 months, why am I migrating it? Is it still relevant? And if it is still relevant, rather than migrate it, because it might be really complicated, rather than migrate it, maybe I need to start again in 8, and just because once a year I've got time to be able to redesign that in 8 and be better in 8 rather than migrate it. So there's different approaches for different types of content. So then we sort of talk about deploy and upskill. Do I, and that's really deploying vRealize Automation 8 and upskilling yourself in it. Courses, evaluating those new sort of capabilities that VR8 brings, because actually I might be doing just EC2 instances as an example from an AWS perspective in 7, but we support Route 53, IAM roles, all sorts of other services that you can do in AWS that you couldn't do in VRA 7 natively. But out of the box, we support a lot more cloud native services in Azure and Google and AWS than we did in natively in 7. So think about the new capabilities you might want to add and what new services you can include. And it may be that you decide to start building a vRealize Automation 8 environment for those new services, and then again sunset the old ones or migrate them over time. It's not a one and done. It's not I've migrated, now I can turn this off, unless everything has migrated. Then obviously you can sort of sunset and power off the old environment. But we don't necessarily recommend that you cut over a weekend. It's a long-term transition until obviously you've migrated all the services. Design and build. So once I've deployed it and played with it, understand the new capabilities, then that's when the design happens. Unlike VRA 7, there isn't much you can change in the deployment. It's 1 node or 3 nodes. It's how you consume that deployment once it's deployed. How many tenants do I want? How many projects do I want? What are my approval policies, my data action policies, my lease policies? Do I need custom actions? Do I need custom data policies? Do I need cloud zones? How do I carve up my data center into cloud zones? Which regions in the cloud do I want to consume? That's where the designing really happens. And then again, transforming, what new services do I want to offer? What am I looking forward? What do I want? I've migrated the stuff that I've got already. I'm doing the basic, Windows virtual machines and Linux virtual machines for development. And once that's all done, what new services do I need to provision and create for my customers? And if I'm going to transform and migrate those from my old environment, then use the tools that are there if you can. Extensibility is a really sort of hot topic. Essentially, if you forget about the APIs for vRealize Automation 7, we would expect somewhere between 85 and 90% of your workload or your workflows to work in 8 if they work in 7, especially if they're using out-of-the-box functionality. If they're using third-party plugins and that third-party plugin also works in 8 or has been updated to work in 8, again, would expect those plugins and those workflows to work. There may be some minor changes. There may be some differences in the way that data types are consumed, but essentially most of that should just work. And if you're doing XAS in a vRA7, putting an XAS form in front of a workflow, then you can do exactly the same thing in 8. You can take that workflow, put it into the service catalog, create a custom form, and then you can consume that as a catalog item. That part of it doesn't really change. Where the change happens is if you're using VRO to run VRA in 7 using the Cafe API or the .NET API, that's just not going to work. Those APIs are deprecated, they don't exist, and any of those workflows that you're going to or you're using just won't work. And that's that's a result of the fact that we've moved this whole to a whole new modern architecture, API first platform, but it's just a different API because we're not using .NET, we're not using the Cafe API anymore, and that's just one of the sort of results of that. So once you've worked out what, if anything, needs to be upgraded, you then have to go through a process really mentally about whether or not I need to upgrade. What do I need to upgrade from a workflow extensibility perspective? Do I say to myself, well, that workflow sort of works right now. There's some extra bits in there that I don't really need, but actually it works. And the person who wrote it doesn't work here anymore. I don't really know what it does. I can sort of tweak it. Do I do that? And that, do I make the small tweaks to make sure that it works in vRealize Automation 8 and leave it as it is? And that's the lowest investment option. Just enough changes to the workflows to make sure they work. Do I decide to reinvest in reviewing all my workflows and say, well, this workflow has a load of stuff in it I no longer need anymore, so I'm going to take all that out, I'm going to make it a bit more streamlined, I'm going to actually, maybe even start using Node.js and Python and PowerShell in vRealize Automation 8, which is available, rather than the JavaScript stuff. So actually, I can, all that REST API stuff that I might be doing, in JavaScript, I can now, I haven't got the skills anymore, but I've got someone in those Python or PowerShell, and I can start to use their skills instead. And so you can sort of reduce that technical debt by changing the workflows, and or maybe even moving to ABX or maybe even moving to SaltStack to do some of the work that I'm doing already. So it's a sort of not quite the minimum investment, but making sure that it's not, if it suddenly creates an email to someone, but that from a DR perspective, as an example, but I don't need to do that anymore because that's not our process anymore. Do I decide to take that out, or do I decide to leave it where it is and just ignore the emails as they come in? And so that's sort of the thing you would look at. And then finally, you can do a reinvention. You can take what you've got in those workflows and just say, well, actually, all I'm doing is some API calls to a third-party system. I'm not using external plugins. I'm just doing API using VRO. The REST API function in VRO to connect to a REST endpoint. And actually, do I need to do that in an orchestrator workflow? Could I do that as an ABX action running as a function as a service? Have a view at using. I'm not saying everything in VRO should become ABX at all, but the right tool for the right job. If I've got a plugin that I'm using, it could be a third-party IPAM plugin, a hardware plugin, it could be ServiceNow plugin or whatever. That's different to I'm using VRO to do some logic and do some calculations and then spit back a number into the deployment. Then I could probably do that with ABX. and it would be a lot easier. I can write that in Node.js, Python, PowerShell, just as a function, as a service platform. Again, running in within vRealize Automation 8 on premise, or if I'm doing cloud workloads in AWS and Azure. So again, it's like a reinvent and a renaissance on deciding, where to host that extensibility. On premises, okay, sorry, Kevin. And what we talk to customers quite a lot about, and I'm cognizant of the time, and I'm only halfway through my slides, is that the first thing you need to do is sort of map your current state and where you want to go. You want to then, one of the key things within a cloud management platform now, whether that be using operations or whether automation or network insight, is this tagging strategy. Tagging is really, really important. vRealize Automation uses tagging to tag capabilities and then constrain the deployments to that capabilities from its provisioning decision trees and engine. But also you can tag workloads in vSphere and AWS, Azure, or Google, and use those in other tool sets, such as dynamic grouping in operations to be able to have reports for dashboards and so on and so forth. So tagging strategy becomes really important, but it's really important across the piece. So you don't create a tagging strategy in isolation. It's something that you need to agree across all of the tool sets to make sure that you're using all of the same tags and understand that. So it's simple and used by all. From an assessment perspective, again, you analyze the blueprints, the workflows. Do I need them? Am I using things like component profiles? Am I using nested blueprints? Nested blueprints still not supported, I don't believe, from a migration perspective. How do I deal with that? What data actions do I need? Because they're slightly different in vRealize Automation 8 to Line 7. Really understand the services that you want to provide. That allows you to identify those gaps that may be in the product, and then produce a transition plan to either fill those gaps or include new services as well. So it might be that, oh, I can't do this right now, but I know it's coming, or actually I want, at the moment I'm getting lots of requests for AWS blueprints, but we don't do that right now, but we could do that. But let's get all the stuff that we're currently doing, 80%, 80-20 rule, right? So 80% of our requests are for vSphere virtual machines, with network selection and so on and so forth. So let's get all that working, get that all onboarded, and then worry about the 20% of the resources or the services that I need in the future. But have a map, just like we have a roadmap of services that we introduce. From a company perspective, try and get that roadmap for you as well, be able to deliver the services. Because if you can say to your customers, this is what we're doing right now, these are the services we provide, but in 6 months' time we're going to provide these services too, or here's a list of services that we're going to provide, and that roadmap, just like our roadmap as a software company, changes based on customer priority. So if suddenly you say, oh, in 6 months' time we're going to do this, but you've got some really big projects coming along that need that might be in 3 months' time now, not 6 months' time. So until you've got that roadmap of services that you want to provide, it's very difficult to prioritize. I need the next slide, or that slide. So one of the things to consider is consumption. So, and again, I sort of said it a couple of times, whether or not you're going to have your end users, because in vRealize Automation 8, there was a vRealize Automation 7, sorry, there was a catalog, but it was all the same product. In vRealize Automation 8 right now, there's different services that deliver. So from a role-based access control perspective, if you're an end user, you don't need access, and you're just responsible for requesting catalog items. You don't need access to Cloud Assembly. You don't need access to sort stack config. You don't need access to orchestrator. And so you need to define and decide where your end users and you as an IT organization are going to be consuming these services. Because again, from a role-based access point of view, if I'm just an end user, I just need to be a member of the organization or tenant, and then a member of the project that I want to deploy to, and then a member of the service broker, and I can deploy anything that project can do. But if I'm suddenly a blueprint author, I need access to Cloud Assembly, I need to be a project member, as well as if I want to also deliver services for the service broker, I might need to be a service broker user as well. So it's the key thing is the API surface has the same role-based access control as the user interface. So if I'm a user in the user interface, I'm a user in the API. If I'm an administrator, I'm an administrator in the API. And so you just need to make sure you work out what that access looks like and how you want people to consume. Do you want them to use Terraform Provider? Do you want them to use API calls? Do you want them to use user interface? It's up to you guys to decide. A lot more options in vRealize Automation 8 than there was in 7. And this is an example from a customer. So this was a blueprint and the events around that blueprint. So they had ServiceNow as their front end portal. We still support that in 8, being able to put the catalog in ServiceNow. They had a number of sort of different composite blueprints with different individual deployments. So 2012, 2008, 2016. You can see that. I don't know why 2021's there, but I know what that is because I did a find and replace on 2019 and replaced it for 2020 for my slides. So I need to update that. And then, Snow Forms used the VRA API, all that infrastructure in there. And then it had a number of event broker topics. So adding DNS, and you can see that there, Snow Discovery, all that sort of stuff, and different places within the life cycle of the virtual machine. And when our PSO engaged on that and said, well, this is what we think it should look like in the future, let's have a conversation. And then suddenly you've got this agnostic set of blueprints rather than being operating system specific, being able to say, well, here's a Windows blueprint that you can have a drop down and you can choose the operating system, rather than having to have a Windows blueprint for 2019 and 2016 and 2008. You can just have a drop down. And same with Red Hat. And then again, event brokers topics, Snow configuration into VRA 8. But we then start to look at some of those tasks that they were doing, and we sort of said, well, actually, that DRIP email, we don't use that really anymore. It's not really relevant, so let's remove it. From the add DNS, we needed to make some changes because they've changed the way they do things, and the register satellite and the unregister. And so we made some changes to the workflows, but the stuff we kept, and the stuff we needed to change got changed. And they were put to different event broker states, and then the blueprint worked. But we decided, we took what we had, changed what we needed to, and got what we needed. And that's the way, to migrate those blueprints and those sort of services. Any questions? Again, please feel free to interrupt at any time, so I can get a drink if nothing else. The only real difference, or the main difference is from a 7 to an 8 perspective when we use events, is that there are different payloads. So you have, in 7 there was payload, in 8 there's sort of input properties, so different objects, and that's one thing to be aware of. And that's the main thing to be aware of. There are different sort of placement logic rules, if you like. So in 7 we had location. If you enabled it, you have a service, you have an entitlement, you have environment, you have zones, and you could do all that sort of example user inputs. And that would, it may be custom code, maybe custom code for network selection and so on and so forth. But in 8, the way we do things again is tags, and that's really what drives our provisioning engine and our allocation engine. Now we take that capability and say, well, this cloud zone is production, or this cloud zone is development, or this network profile is production, or this is AWS, or this is vSphere, and the tags just have to be relevant to you. You could call them Rod, Jane, and Freddie if you wanted to, red, blue, and green. It really depends. It's metadata. It's really what's relevant to you. It could be your network profiles, or your networks could be the VLAN tags if that's what you want. And then we use the blueprint. In the blueprints, we use those capability tags that are stored in vRealize Automation to constrain where the things get deployed. Yeah, rainbow every day. every day. And that's really where the tagging strategy happens, right? So you've got your user inputs, and your user inputs in the form essentially can drive the tag selection, which drive the allocation. So you might choose as a drop down dev, and that you've got a cloud account that's tagged as dev, and maybe a cloud zone that's dev, or you might say I want vSphere dev. 2 drop downs, and your vSphere cloud account will be tagged as vSphere, and your cloud zone might be tagged as dev. And then that really sort of decides where things are provisioned. You might have same cloud zone could be in the same data center, but a different cluster. So you might have dev and test in the same under the same vCenter, but in different clusters. And that's where the tagging really sort of determines where things are placed. And then obviously we can offload to vRops for final sort of placement decisions. The only other thing I wanted to say was that if you're doing a defined tag strategy, make it simple, make it easy, have a document centralized and maintained by everybody. Use key value pair. Don't just put red or blue. Put zone equals zone : red, or network : blue. Network : VLAN 100. And just define what you're going to do and then stick to it. And then everybody uses it, understandable by all. And that's the best way to have a tagging strategy. And that's essentially all I wanted to talk about today, which is not bad for me. I'm only 2 minutes over, apparently. Any questions?
Chris, it's Rick here.
Hi, Rick.
In 8.2, that's August last year, we added support for running Terraform configurations directly from the vRealize interface. I know it's simple. You can just point your code repository at the GitHub or GitLab, whichever. You mentioned Salt Stack. Do you see that as complementary, or you're going to change in future versions, or?
So we are not going. So to be clear, as far as I'm aware, and looking in at least the next 12 to 18 months, there is no plans to change any of our support for any other products such as Ansible, Terraform, and Puppet. In fact, I think in 8.4 there's some enhancements to the Red Hat Ansible and Puppet endpoints as well. So just because we acquired SaltStack doesn't mean we are going to change the way we support other tool sets.
Here's another one, a twister for you. So talking to this customer, they want to do some infrastructure as code, hence the discussion about things like Terraform and other forms of YAML. So they said, that's great. You've got all these new features coming. It's going to make it really easy for us. But can you give us a case study where you were doing it a year ago? How do you get around the fact that our product didn't do it a year ago and lack of case studies?
From a Terraform perspective, or from an infrastructure code perspective. So Terraform Provider has been around since VRA 8. So 8.0 it came out. So there have I got case studies? Maybe I'd have to have a look, to be honest. But I mean, infrastructure as code, and VRA 7 did infrastructure as code. It just didn't let you create it. It's still stored as a YAML file when you export those blueprints, or you capture them via the lifecycle manager. They're still YAML files. So it's always done infrastructure code. We just haven't enabled customers to write it themselves. It's very much. It was used to be very much a drag and drop, connect, fill out the boxes. The code's written in the background, but you don't actually get to see it.
But just in general, if you're introducing new features which have just landed, you're in month 1 of the new feature set.
Yeah.
How would you reply to somebody that says, could you provide a case study on something that has only just been invented?
Well, it depends on what the case study is for. So the use of a Terraform module, as an example, a provider, sorry, that Terraform and its providers have been around for a while. All we're doing is allowing a user to consume that and add some enterprise sort of Terraform open source, that is, rather than Terraform Enterprise, and consume that and use the governance policies and the governance engines around the VRA give on top of that. So the actual consumption of a provider via Terraform, probably not on us to sort of provide like a reference, if you like. It's a difficult one because we've added support based on popular demand, essentially, for Terraform, and because lots of people use it, and we'd rather them use our platform and consume Terraform than another platform and consume Terraform.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, I guess if you've got a particular customer, reach out to me and we can have a conversation.
Yes, it's like as you say, which platform gets the eyes. In your other example, you had people using ServiceNow as the front end catalog. But you could do integration the other way around, where vRealize is the front end catalog and portal, triggering into ServiceNow. But yes,
yeah,
same analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like one of these job adverts that asks for 25 years of cloud experience?
yeah,
That's the one.
Yeah. The candidate needs to be, a VCDX, a CCIE, and everything else under the sun, and we're going to pay them half the market rate.
Indeed. Cool. Okay. So
I almost applied there, but then he said.
Has anybody got any other questions for Chris? That was, I think it was quite interesting, actually. No. Okay. All right. Well, so Chris, thanks very much. I mean, so we're a little bit into lunch, so we've actually got a break now until 2 o'clock. He says, looking at the agenda, that he should know. So like I say, we've got 50 minutes. So if you want to pop your webcam on and grab a drink, we can do what we did earlier and just have a bit of a chat. Or feel free to go and sort yourself out for lunch. Cool.
We pause through lunch. Is someone going to pause?